Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Zonda Wine Podcast. I'm here with Ben Aneff. He is the managing partner at Tribeca Wine Merchants, where we are today. We're in a very cool cellar. Ben sources the greatest wines in the world, some of which you can see behind me right here. But he doesn't only do that. He is the head of the U.S. Wine Trade Alliance. Is that correct? And also a board member at the National Association of Wine Retailers. So, Ben, thank you so much for
Well, thanks for
being here
having me,
today.
Sean. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So, our point of discussion here is tariffs. And I want to ask you a very simple question. What is a tariff?
A tariff is a tax on an imported good.
Okay. And a tax on imported good, do we currently have, before this administration started, did we have tariffs in place?
It's a good question. So let's say for wine specifically, there was a duty, but it's really, let's say about 25 cents per bottle, regardless of the cost of the bottle.
Okay.
So it didn't matter if it was a $2 wine or a $200 wine. The importer would pay about 25 cents. So nothing that would impact trade at all, really.
Okay, and it was per bottle or something?
Exactly. And by the way, it's reciprocal, meaning that, let's say, U.S. domestic exports of wine going over to Europe, and that's the big market we're talking about, basically the same. It's pennies per bottle.
Yeah.
And the difference now is we have what's called an ad valorem tariff, and that's based on the value of the product that's being imported. So the way it would work is whatever the PO is to the importer, whatever the producer overseas, they issue a bill to the U.S. importer. Customs is going to charge a percentage-based tariff on it. And right now, the post-April 2nd Liberation Day, or whatever you want to call it, for Europe, the total was 20%, but we're currently in a pause, so it's 10%. So effectively every imported product around the world, wine or other, has a 10% tariff on it.
Yeah, and just so the listener understands, today is Thursday, June 12th. I know things change all the time, so I do want to have a date set here. So the tariff, what you were saying is, before all this happened, it was 25 cents. It was reciprocal that way, whether California or winery were selling to Europe and vice versa.
Effectively, pennies on the bottle, didn't matter how much it costs.
And did the tariff have anything to do with alcohol percentage, or was this was wine related?
Sort of. I mean, the way the tariff codes worked, it would be up to a certain percentage of alcohol, but
it was mostly on the product itself.
Yeah, exactly.
Something like that. Okay. And what I want to understand here is, for tariffs, who ends up paying it? I think that's a big question that we talk about, and ultimately the consumer ends up paying it, because you said that if a producer in Europe sells to the importer, right? The importer buys it. At that point, the U.S. importer has to pay that tariff.
I mean, really simple. The U.S. Customs sends the tariff bill to the U.S. importer, and they have something like 10 days to pay it. Otherwise, it doesn't get to come into the United States.
Exactly. And how did producers react to this? Because you're a retailer, and you are selling wines from Europe as well. Sure. How did you see this unfolding with producers that you were working with, or importers as well?
Well, it's really the U.S. importers and distributors that are the first. Those are the guys that are in the first. The first tranche of consequence. And there was kind of a range. I mean, initially, before, let's say, mid-February, there was a thought that there's some general risk of some tariffs, but no firm idea what it would be. Mm-hmm. And then we had a potential threat of 200% tariffs on effectively all imported wine and spirits from the European Union. Exactly. And at that point, you had, let's say, every distributor and importer of wine and spirits in the U.S. had to effectively halt every single container coming from Europe, because it would just bankrupt them. I mean, I would get innumerable calls from small distributors and importers. And remember, most of these are small family-owned businesses. Mm-hmm. Something like 4,000 importers and distributors. And even really famous distributors, like, let's say, Skurnik Wines, there's still only a few hundred employees. These are still small businesses.
We're not talking big ones.
So the reality for those guys is, they can't pick up the phone and call Jamie Dimon and get a couple $100 million extra, because they've got a tariff they weren't planning on.
Yeah.
So when we had that initial time frame with a threat of 200%, you had people concerned, businesses that were started by their father or their grandfather, and they're saying, gosh, if I get a container that walks in the door and I'm going to have to pay this, I'm going to go bankrupt.
Yeah, and you can't have the ship sitting there in the middle of the sea, right? So this is like big logistical headaches for producers, because if the wine's heading to the port, you basically have to stop it from getting off the
once it's on a ship in transit, it's not stopping. It's coming. There's nothing you can do at that point.
Exactly.
You might be able to send the wine back, but that's super expensive too. Nobody wants this. And then April 2nd, we had an announcement that there would be effectively 10% tariffs on every product from around the world, and then a series of different countries would have these so-called additional tariffs. On the wine side, that meant effectively an extra, I think, 10% for the European Union.
So that would have been 20.
20 total, exactly right. And then a total of 31% from South Africa. Other than China, which is sort of a separate bucket, and they're technically, obviously, a very large wine producer, but we're not a large consumer of Chinese wines. But other than China, South Africa had the largest tariff.
Why Trump was a big proponent of these tariffs? What's the point of them? What does it do? What's it supposed to do in his eyes?
It's a good question. I think generally the president, first of all, he doesn't like the idea of the U.S. having a trade deficit. And, a trade deficit means the United States buys more from other countries than they buy from us. Typically, that wasn't thought of as super problematic. As a matter of fact, in U.S. history, we have almost always had a trade deficit or a growing trade deficit when our economy is doing really well. The only times when we've had a shrinking trade deficit or no trade deficit are times where the U.S. is doing really poorly. So you think the financial crisis or the Great Depression, those types of periods.
Yeah.
In a nutshell, the United States is wealthier than other countries. And when we're also growing faster than those countries, it's pretty simple. We buy more than those countries can afford to buy from us. Just like if you live, if you live next to a neighbor who's spectacularly wealthy and you're not quite as wealthy, they probably buy more stuff. The other thing that's complicated about this trade deficit piece, or why for a very long time, the vast majority of economists say it's not a problem, is when you have a trade deficit, by definition, you have what's called a capital surplus. It's like an accounting ledger. If your trade deficit is -1, your capital surplus is +1. And a capital surplus is where other countries are giving us their money. They're buying things like they're buying things like U.S. Treasuries. They're putting money in the U.S. stock market.
In the US,
we're giving them U.S. dollars,
Exactly.
and they're putting U.S. dollars in Treasuries and U.S. dollars in the stock market.
There's more dollars floating
exactly
around.
Right. Okay. Which is also why the U.S. was the world's reserve currency. It's one of the things that helps that. So that capital surplus helps the U.S. have lower yields on Treasury, which goes to lower mortgage rates, lets the United States borrow money at a cheaper rate than other countries, strengthens the U.S. dollar. And that's the other piece here. Since we've had this sort of April 2nd, Liberation Day, reciprocal tariff announcement, the U.S. dollar has also, sort of collapsed.
Yeah.
For instance, the euro costs about 15% more today than it did on January 1st. So right now we have this 10% tariff, but on top of that 10% tariff, the dollar is also less valuable. It costs 15% more to buy anything from most of the world.
And as of today, we're sort of in a pausing period, right? Right now we're at 10%, but the president has said there might be a 50%, what I'm trying to say is all these numbers are being thrown around. If you were to advise a producer, would you tell them, listen, this is just going to blow over, this is just all...
It's a great question.
The tariffs maybe are a way to get better deals on trade with other countries, and that's it. They're a leverage.
That's a piece of it. I mean, the president absolutely wants better trade deals with other countries. There are some legitimate trade issues that the United States has with the European Union in particular. I will say, trade with wine is reciprocal. Initially, the idea was we're going to have reciprocal tariffs, and we do have reciprocal trade with the European Union on wine. And on spirits, there's no tariff on U.S. spirits going into the European Union.
It's like collateral damage here with the tariffs.
I mean, there's absolutely zero tariff on U.S. spirits being shipped from the United States to the European Union. And again, domestic U.S. wines have only pennies on the dollar tariff going into the European Union. So we have a situation with wine and spirits where we do have reciprocal trade, where we American domestic producers have free and have fair trade access to European markets the same way European producers had access to American markets. The trade volume is different, obviously. I mean, the United States only produces something like 10% of the world's wine. Europe produces something like 75% of the world's tradable wine. So obviously, we buy more European wines than they do, American wines. But in terms of, at this point, it's the market that gets to decide, which, for a lot of us is the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
But
that's why a lot of people want to sell in the U.S. market. It's competitive, but you have a lot of choices. You have opportunities to stand out.
Exactly. I mean, the other thing that's really key, I think, and separates separates wine from any other product or wine and spirits from any other product. American businesses, mostly small family-owned businesses, make a lot more money and are able to keep a lot more money from the imports of European wines than on effectively any other product. For every dollar we spend on, let's say, a bottle of Italian wine or French wine, U.S. businesses, from importers, distributors, restaurants, and retailers, make $4.52. Say that again. For every dollar we spend in Europe on a bottle of wine, American businesses, mostly small businesses,
they make more on
make $4.52. And the reason, it's what I call the Dom Perignon wine store problem. There is no such thing as a Dom Perignon wine store. You can't have it in the wine world. A producer of wine in the European Union, they don't set up a store in the United States. They sell to a U.S. importer. Almost all of them are small family-owned businesses. That importer sells to a U.S. distributor. That distributor sells to U.S. wine retailers like me and U.S. restaurants around the world. And because of that, for every dollar we spend over there, we make $4.52. I'd contrast this with basically any other product. Like, let's say a French fashion product. You can manufacture it in France. You can export it to the United States yourself. You can sell it out of a name brand building or a name brand store at the Galleria in Dallas or Michigan Avenue in Chicago.
Yeah,
and take 100% of the profits back to France.
Yeah, it's because of the three-tier system with alcohol that you're supporting U.S. businesses along the way.
You can't do that with wine. So it makes wine a really inefficient way to try to solve an underlying trade problem.
Got it, I understand. And that's sort of what we were talking about in the first administration. I believe tariffs was also an issue there, correct? This had to do with more subsidies with airplane parts or something.
That's exactly
like
right. You had the Airbus tariffs, which, in another year, we're on a pause with that, but that issue is going to come back up in another year.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that. Okay.
So with that, the EU was illegally subsidizing Airbus, and the World Trade Organization allowed the United States to put in tariffs on a given dollar value of product from the European Union. And one of those products they chose to put tariffs on was wine, and they put tariffs on wine at 25%. Now, interestingly, Airbus itself, who was the recipient of these illegal subsidies, they were tariffs between 0 and 10%. So how on earth does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it honestly doesn't. And when you talk about the tariffs here, you've been to DC to advocate with the U.S. Wine Trade Alliance. When you explain this part where every dollar we spend on a European wine, the U.S. makes $4.52, you had mentioned. What's their response to that? Are people listening in DC, or do you feel like you're talking to a wall?
Well, it's a great question. When we first started going during the Boeing Airbus issue, this three-tier system thing was kind of brand new. I mean, and what I mean by that is no one in the federal government really understood it. Because remember, there's not a wine czar. All of the, this is a consequence of the way prohibition was repealed, but it's not run by the federal government. So there isn't one person who had a mastery of these things. You're honestly really surprised. They sort of vaguely knew about it. There's been some Supreme Court cases, but most of the, for instance, lobbying in the wine world goes to state governments, because state governments are the ones who control most of these laws. Yeah. Now, when we go back, and I'll tell you, restaurants all over the country have been really panicked about it, because their biggest source of their biggest revenue generator and their biggest profit generator is imported wine. I mean, there's a,
And maybe spirits too. I don't know, spirits and beer.
Spirits too, but there's more labor costs with spirits, so it costs a lot more to make your, you're making a $15 cocktail. There, it might take a while. You've got a bartender, you're paying a lot. Whereas a good waiter or waitress can open up your bottle of wine and serve it to you well.
Yeah.
But I mean, I was just there with some really fabulous, restaurant folks. Mike Lotta from the Fig and Ordinary in Charleston, Kenny Lyons from Husk and Neighborhood Restaurant Group in Nashville and Charleston. Andy Ticer from Memphis, and they all tell basically the same story. It's like a restaurant business is tough. Like out of $1, at the end of the year they get to keep 3 pennies.
Yeah,
3 pennies.
No, the margins are
tiny, and the thing that gives them the biggest margin is their wine program, and especially imported wines. So like Andy Ticer from Memphis has this great collection of Italian restaurants, and he'll tells the story pretty easily. He can sell a $15 glass of wine, and it can be an amazing bottle. He bought it for $15, and he can sell 5 glasses, so he's making 5x his cost. Yeah. But again, it's not a luxury. Like there's no other product that he can do that with. His customer feels great about it. He actually gets to make some real profit on this. And at the end of the year, he's still only up 3 pennies.
You're attacking
that
the thing
wine program subsidizes the rest of his business. They have super high labor costs. They've been, the cost of ingredients have been going up. The cost of every type of supply is going up. The cost of real estate's been going up. And now the cost of capital, the cost to borrow money has been going up.
So now it's almost like you're educating the people that you're going to in DC to explain who are, imposing these issues, right?
Well,
they are not aware
I'll tell you,
this.
Congress is not imposing these. So we go, and one of the things we often do is we'll go to particularly to important senators or representatives that have some tie to trade, whether you're on the Ways and Means Committee or Senate Finance, where you oversee USTR, that's the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and we'll bring in their local restaurants, and their local restaurants will tell them, this is my problem right now.
Yeah.
And
you have to hit them. You have to hit them where it hurts, right? You have to.
Well, but moreover, they and they want to know. People go to DC to help. I really think they do, and every single person we talk to understands, and they feel, they're not happy about it. A lot of people in Congress they're really concerned, particularly about the way these tariffs hit small and medium-sized businesses around the U.S.
Exactly, and I want to pay attention to tariffs in other industries too, right? So the president had said tariffs on steel, right? To bring steel back, to bring manufacturing back. The whole idea is to bring it back to the U.S. At the end of the day, are California wineries, Oregon wineries, Washington wineries, are they happy about this? Like, does it help them in the end, or no?
Great question. So your steel piece is really relevant because that's kind of the classic example. If you put a tariff on steel or aluminum, every domestic producer of steel or aluminum loves you. They're super happy about it.
Yeah.
And by the way, like the previous U.S. trade ambassador under President Trump, Robert Lighthizer, he was a steel lawyer for a long time, so no surprise that he came in and put steel tariffs in place. But that's the way tariffs typically work. Domestic producers usually like a tariff on imported goods. But in the wine world, it's not the way it works. Every major wine organization, domestic wine growing organization in the United States, from the Wine Institute in DC to Napa Valley Vintners, they're all absolutely against tariffs on wine, and for really good and easy reasons. First of all, the products are not fungible. One is not a substitute for another. The reality is, as consumers on your podcast are going to know, consumers have real choice, and it's a different product. You told me just a few minutes ago, you love Andremoli, a great Grenache, but you have friends who absolutely dislike Andremoli. They probably love a Grenache from, I'm going to say from Pignon and Chateauneuf-du-Pape.
Yeah.
They're different. It's a totally different product.
Exactly.
And I sort of think of it along the lines of like vegetables and fruits. Like if you come to me and say, hey, I really want some strawberries, and I said, gosh, you know what? I don't have any strawberries, but here's a tomato. It's also fruit and it's also red. That's great, but that's not the same thing.
Yeah, I was looking for a Nebbiolo, but I got Cabernet.
It's not the same. It's not the same thing. And moreover, the economics of it just show it. And even the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, I think, understands at this point these wines are really not fungible. Like, consumers are not broadly substituting, a California Cabernet for, a product from a product from France. If someone wants champagne, they want champagne. If someone wants a Napa Cabernet, they want a Napa Cabernet. I mean, Napa makes world-class wines. California, Oregon, Washington make world-class wines. They're different than a bottle of Chianti or a bottle of Burgundy. Or
there's certain grapes that's Sangiovese and Sonoma doesn't work. There's certain grapes that don't.
Exactly, it's a different product. But
exactly.
The other big piece that we've absolutely seen is, it's not just European producers who have to rely on the 3-tier. It's domestic producers too.
Exactly.
And so, for instance, I'm a wine retailer in New York City, and as silly as I may think it is, I am not allowed to buy direct from a U.S. domestic wine producer. And what that means is that domestic producers absolutely rely on healthy wine distributors for access to market. Mm-hmm. If you're a wine grower in Oregon or Washington or California or Texas or Virginia, and you want to have a business, you need to have your wine in retail shelves and on wine lists in Chicago and Houston and Orlando and New York City and all over the country.
Yeah. And
you rely on a distributor to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And most distributors, 75% of their revenue is coming from imported wine.
Yeah.
That is flat reality, and it's not going to change.
Exactly.
And when they take a huge hit to their revenue, American domestic wines are expensive to buy. It's a big investment. Most of these are small family-owned producers. A distributor needs to believe in you. They need to invest both the money in bringing your wine in, but also invest in their staff, invest in training their salespeople, invest in their local accounts to teach them about your wine. It's a lot of money at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And when distributors get hit with big tariff bills, they have less capital. What that means, full stop, they buy less American wine. The last time we had these tariffs, one of my very favorite domestic Pinot Noirs, Perkins Harder from Willamette Valley in Oregon, lost their distribution in New York. In New York, of all places, one of the most important markets in the world. And they had an incredible wine distributor, knew all of the best retail shops, all of them could get it on incredible wine by the glass programs. They got hit with a huge tariff bill. Now all of a sudden they couldn't afford to bring in Perkins Harder anymore.
Exactly, and we talk about the importers and distributors get affected by this, their bottom line. One of the stories we read in recent weeks is that a small family importer, I think his name was Victor Schwartz, I forget his name, he filed a lawsuit against the president's tariffs and I believe won this lawsuit. Can you break this down? What happened there?
Sure. Well,
this was...
Victor was a part of, there's a series of small businesses around the United States that challenged these what we call IEEPA tariffs. And so the current tariffs that are in place are, they're using this national security exception that's allowing that the president says gives him the ability to put broad tariffs on every product effectively without going through Congress. That's not typically the way it's worked. The Congress has the ability to regulate trade. Now they have passed bills that give the president that ability under certain circumstances. So, for instance, there are what's called 301 investigations. So the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative can start an investigation if they believe that there's a discriminatory practice held overseas. If a country is discriminating against American businesses, then the U.S. can investigate that claim and then come up with a dollar value award and then ask the public, the United States public, gosh, we think, country A is discriminating against us and it's costing us $1 billion. Here's a list of products that we think we should tariff as a response to that. What do you think? You have to have a public comment period. And then the public would respond, and then they would determine how to counter that tariff. Typically, you would do a like-for-like, tariff. If they're hurting our dairy farmers, we're going to hurt their dairy farmers. Something along those lines.
Okay.
You'd sort of call it reciprocal. That's the other word.
But hearing that a lot. Yeah.
All of those were bills that had been passed where Congress is giving the president this band of authority under a given set of circumstances. What's different now is the IEPA authority that the president is talking about doesn't actually mention the word tariffs anywhere. Doesn't. So there's a couple of different questions. One is like, is this really a national security crisis? You also saw these IEPA tariffs used, or this national security reasoning given behind the tariffs on Mexico and Canada, right? So during President Trump's first term, they renegotiated NAFTA into the new trade deal, MSMCA. I can't quite remember, but now he came into office and said there is a fentanyl crisis. That's a national security emergency.
Okay, so it's
Now,
using
now
national
Canada strongly Canada says by your own records, you've only seen 39 pounds of fentanyl that's coming to the United States from Canada, which everyone in the wine business knows 39 pounds. That's basically the weight of one case of wine.
Yeah.
And so they're like, is that really a national security?
So Victor was kind of arguing that this wasn't a national security issue.
So the question is kind of twofold. Is for instance in this other issue, there was the reciprocal trade issue, is this trade deficit a national security crisis? Like, we've existed for a trade deficit for most of our country's history, and our economy has been, typically booms when we have.
Like you had said earlier in this conversation.
When we're really wealthy, we have a trade deficit.
When things aren't going well, we don't have a trade deficit.
So is this really a national security crisis? But also, the underlying law behind, that gives the U.S. some authority to go into action doesn't actually say the word tariff, I don't believe, as a solve here. So what's happened right now is the International Trade Court ruled in favor of this group and said these tariffs were illegal. They've gone to an appeals court, and currently there's a stay of the International Trade Court decision. And so what that means is the International Trade Court's decision that all of these tariffs are illegal has been put on pause.
Okay.
While the president gets to argue the underlying merits of the case, and the appeals court will hear those underlying.
Okay, but for now the 10% is still there.
For now, because that ITC decision was stayed by the appeals court, the 10% tariffs are still here. Okay. And on July 9th, right now there's a pause, by the way, in the additional tariffs that would be 20% on the EU, 31% in like some other countries. Anyway, that could go in July 9th. The president, you did mention, has threatened up to 50%. That's a trade embargo.
Up to 200%.
Well, previously up to 200.
Yeah, previously.
But more recently, he's threatened 50% on everything from Europe. That's a trade embargo.
Yeah.
Can't even. I don't know what the economic devastation would be in the U.S.
People describe it as a death knell, but I think one thing that a lot of people are thinking about, and what me and you as wine lovers are, is how does the international community or the international wine community see us now at the U.S. market? Do you think that producers are going to start looking to other markets, saying, look, trading with the U.S. has caused me migraines every day. I'm just moving my stuff, and I'm going to focus on the Russian, French, Italian market, something like that?
I mean, it's a great question. I mean, look, the U.S. is the most important wine market in the world, full stop. On the other hand, the most coveted producers in the world are going to have choices. And the way we navigate, this upcoming period of time will absolutely impact, how producers decide to. Most of the best producers that your friends drink, they sell every single bottle of wine out of their winery every single year, or every single bottle they want to sell. And so that's definitely a concern. I mean, look, I'm incredibly passionate about like this narrow band of what I consider to be the greatest wines of the world.
Yes.
And you know the way it is. I mean, I'm in retail. Like, we're always fighting for every single bottle. I mean, we have the largest allocation of Loire Musigny in the U.S. We'll get more than anyone in the country. I mean, we're incredibly passionate about those. And do we want more? Of course. But you fight for every single bottle that that you can get. I mean, if I pull this bottle of Dauphiné off the shelf, they made a couple of thousand bottles of this. They make 300 bottles of the Village Meursault.
Exactly.
They're going to sell these wines, and even Bordeaux is even larger wineries are going to have choices to make. I still believe. Look, ultimately, the U.S. is an incredible market for wine.
And you don't see people giving up on the U.S. market at all.
We're super passionate about it. We, consumers absolutely love it. We go and we visit the vineyards. We want to see the vigneron. When Americans get obsessed with something, we get obsessed, whether it's baseball cards or Bordeaux. And
I agree with that. I think long term, if we look at past all this, there is light at the end of the tunnel, and producers should definitely not shift their focus from the U.S. market. I mean, it's a lot of wine lovers.
I think any producer that comes here and visits starts to understand like how passionate Americans are about great wine. I mean, look, we had our first Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, was basically the first wine importer.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think he wrote the first anti-wine tariff letter to a future Secretary of State when he was just a citizen, asking them to remove tariffs on wine.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, and Thomas Jefferson loved wine from France. I mean, in his books he talks about that. And when you come here to the U.S., I'm from Argentina. Right, and when you go to Argentina, it's a very protectionist nation at the moment, where you go to wine shops and it's all Argentinian wine, which is great, but you come to the US and you are flooded with all these choices. It is one of the most incredible US markets. Even in Italy or France, it's probably very French or Italian dominated, right? I mean, in the US, in the US, you can go to a shop and 5% of it could be US. Here, you really have a lot of choices. Right?
No, that's why we're the sort of global wine hub, without a doubt. And by the way, it helps American wines. Any place that's super protectionist, their domestic industries might have a larger percentage of sales in that country, but they are almost by definition not as good as they would otherwise have been. When you have to compete with the best of the best, it drives yourself. I mean, you know this.
Yeah.
Like every American instinctively knows this. You know what I mean? You want to be a great baseball player.
Very competitive.
Practice with a great baseball player. If you're playing tennis, go out and find the best player you can play against, and that's what American wines get to do.
Even in sports, you have the best players all over the world, in the NBA or in the NFL or anything.
I mean,
like that.
you want competition. Competition drives greatness in yourself, and I think that's one of the reasons why all of the greatest producers of wine in the United States, they all hate wine tariffs, and they're all, by the way, huge passionate consumers of wine from overseas. I mean, I had Sashi Morman in here yesterday, who's I absolutely love Sashi as a person, and I love the Domaine de la Côte and Sandy wines. He's also like one of the single most knowledgeable wine people I know. I remember we were talking about like an old La Palais years ago, I think 2009. And it was before Chablis was super popular.
La Palais being the ultimate Burgundy tasting.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
And it was before, back then people were, you'd bring great white Burgundy, but a lot of big collectors still thought it's mainly they want Grand Cru from the Côte de Beaune. So think Montrachet, Bâtard Montrachet, Chevalier Montrachet, Meursault Perrier, things like that. But Chablis, even Raveneau and Dauvissat, wasn't really quite considered up there, even though most inside wine folks I think really thought it was. And Sashi and I were walking around at the very end of the night. Everybody's kind of going to the after party. There's a full bottle of 1989 Raveneau Clos just sitting there, remarking. But Sashi's like a great example of, one of these domestic producers who is an absolute expert of the best wines of the world. And it's one of the things that's driven the greatness in his own wines.
And we're seeing that as well here at Zonda. We work with Westbourne Wines, a sparkling wine producer out of California that launched a few weeks ago, and they're making sparkling wine from Grand Cru vineyards from California. This is California sparkling wine as an example. I think that if Champagne or Franciacorta or any of these sparkling wines from all over the world weren't available in the U.S., this project would not be being made because it is competing with the highest sparkling wines.
I mean, look at how the Rolling Stones started. They were getting deliveries from like a Cleveland, Ohio music distributor of great old rock and blues. Like, does that happen if you can't hear it?
And that's how the world should be. Yeah.
If you want to be the best, you have to be able to experience the best, and you're not afraid of it. Full stop. I will tell you, there is a narrow band of like domestic. They're not really producers, but like domestic wine growers who have who think that tariffs might help them. They have a different issue, and it's people that make, which is it's a great living, and they're really struggling. If you're a wine grower of, particularly like bulk wine in the Central Coast of California, it's a really sad situation right now. It's really problematic.
A lot of vineyards being ripped out.
Exactly right. But the reality is, the problem has absolutely nothing to do with, any of the wines that you might see. A bottle of Griot Chambertin from, Drouhin has absolutely nothing to do with even any like named producer. Their problem is there is what's called the American appellated law. So there's bulk wine that can be produced in the United States for grocery stores, where the producer can add 25% of foreign imported wine and still call it an American appellation. So if you think things like Boda Box and things like that. But the reality is that the price delta between, let's say Central Coast bulk juice and the cheapest level of imported wine. And by the way, it's not going to be wine from France or Italy. It's going to be wine from, when you get really inexpensive wine, you can go to Chile or Argentina where you can get really inexpensive, cheap bulk juice. And as long as that American appellated law is there, these Central Coast growers are going to have a really tough time. And then you have the broader issue of, the way people drink wine is different now. If you read Silicon Valley Wine Report, you see, people are drinking less wine but more expensive wine. Not even just premium wine, although that's really the only area where there's growth, but they're drinking less often per week, but they're spending a little bit more for it. So kind of by definition, I think people are moving away from some of these bulk wine products.
Exactly. And that 15 plus category is showing some possible growth. So it seems like what we're talking about is the solutions should match the problem. They shouldn't create another problem. So it doesn't seem like there's a match.
Well, and by the way, I'd point out, like, even a huge tariff on imported wine is not going to solve this problem for those Central Coast growers. Yeah, it's just not. Like, it's not going to be enough to make up for the difference in price between like super inexpensive, bulk juice out of, Chile or Argentina.
Yeah. Well, Ben, I want to thank you so much. I think this conversation really enlightened myself on tariffs and where we're at right now. Let's hope that by the time this goes up and by the time more people learn about it, we're not talking about this any longer. So, okay.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it.